I'm OLAM's UK Community Manager, and I'm looking forward to spending the next hour with you discussing another topic of ethical best practices. If you haven't already done so, like I said, do introduce yourself in the chat so people know who is joining us today. So we're going, as I said, today is going to be a brief introduction. We're going to have a couple of presentations from Becky and Laura with a short bit from Angela as well. And then we'll have time for questions and also an activity together. So just to give you a bit more about what Aspire is about. So do have a look at our website to find out more about Aspire. We offer Aspire as a program that's for all of our OLAM's partner organizations and individual members. And it gives you resources and tools to support your organization's work in ethical communication, community engagement, monitoring, evaluation, global volunteering, and now climate practices, our new topic, which we're talking about today. We've compiled lists of useful resources for each of these topics and created ethical spectrum tools that include the key principles and examples of how to carry them out. And also, as a reminder, we're offering micro grants of up to $1,500 a year to partner organizations that have completed the Aspire self-assessment survey to support you in implementing your ethical best practice work. You can also get involved in Aspire peer groups, where OLAM partner organizations can work in small groups with other organizations to develop their ethical practices. And I'm going to share in the chat where you can sign up for peer groups as well. So we actually have another Aspire webinar coming up next month. Reflect, Renew, Rewrite, analysing your website through an ethical lens on the 20th of September. Again, I'll put in the chat the sign up form where you can sign up to come to this webinar next month. So do get ahead on that, and we'll be sending out more information about that in the coming weeks. This webinar is designed to help you take steps forward, ensuring that your website meets international standards of ethical communications. This workshop will include an analysis of the content itself, as well as whether that content is accessible for people with disabilities. There will be a presentation about ethical communication concepts, and each participant will have an opportunity to work with a peer in order to analyse a page of their own organisation's website. So that should be a really great opportunity for everyone. So now coming back to the topic for today, it falls under the topic of ethical climate practices and refers to the third commandment in our ethical spectrum, which is to reduce carbon footprints. We believe strongly that even for organisations where climate work is not part of your core operations or mission, every organisation, especially ones engaged in international development and humanitarian aid work, has a responsibility to think about how they can reduce and mitigate their impact on the climate crisis. The communities we work with in low-income countries are already bearing the brunt of this crisis, and therefore part of our commitment to do no harm needs to include taking our emissions into account. Today, we will get an introduction to practical ways you can reduce your carbon footprint, both in your HQ and home offices and in your work in low-income countries, as well as resources available to you to support you in this journey. And now I'm going to introduce you to our wonderful speakers. I'm thrilled that we're joined today by Becky O'Brien and Laura Hendy. Becky takes a leadership role in Adamar's Jewish Climate Leadership Coalition work, which supports Jewish organisations worldwide to respond to the climate emergency. She will be talking about how we can reduce our HQ-related emissions. Laura leads World Jewish Relief's climate resilience projects, as well as spearheading their work to become a carbon neutral organisation. She will be talking about how to measure and mitigate emissions related to your work in low-income countries, including use of the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator. During her section, we will also get a chance to hear briefly from Angela Musiopi, Human Resources Advisor for Africa and Eurasia for HIAS, who will be talking about HIAS's environmental report that includes use of the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator. Thank you so much for joining us today, Becky, Laura, and Angela. And I'm now going to pass over to Becky, who's going to be starting off our session. Thank you so much, Becky.
Great. Hello, good morning, everybody. Nice to see you. I'm going to put my view here on gallery so I can see all of your names and faces. It's good to be here. It is morning where I am in Colorado in the United States, and I really love being in this space with people from all over the world doing work all over the world. Climate change is certainly global work. So, and thank you very much, Emma, for coordinating us here. I'll just share a few notes and then I will open up my slides, give you something better to look at. But just thank you for joining this space. I'm going to give you some information about the Jewish Climate Leadership Coalition. It is a major new coalition that's relatively recently launched, less than a year old.
So interesting. All these people, they're talking about carbon.
If we can move, great, thank you. It is so interesting. It is, it's true. So this is a new coalition that recently launched of Jewish community organizations who recognize the existential threat and moral urgency of climate change and commit to taking action. And we're going to cover here the why, the how, and the what. Why we need to take on climates and how the Jewish Climate Leadership Coalition will be supporting organizations to do so, and what's involved with the coalition and how to sign up, and sharing with you through the lens here of how you can apply this work within the headquarters of your organization, not necessarily out in the field. And although you'll see that Laura and I both have things to say that really apply in both spaces, so I think that that will be really helpful. So let's go ahead and dive in. And so, first, I think if you're here, you don't really need to be convinced that there's a climate crisis going on, but it's really helpful still to just ground ourselves together in what some of the realities that we're facing, what climate change means for the Earth and its inhabitants, us, and the people that we work for and work to support now and in the future. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change represents the best thinking of thousands of climate scientists from across the world, and the finding of the IPCC's most recent reports make it clear that climate change is human-induced and it is caused by burning fossil fuels. Just some of the basics here. The IPCC makes abundantly clear that we need to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and more immediately make significant reductions by 2030 to avoid the worst case scenarios of what climate crisis could mean for our planet. Climate change causes dangerous and widespread disruption, and it's already affecting the lives of every person on this planet. I've been doing this work for a long time, over 20 years, and climate change used to be a thing that was going to happen in the future and over there. And now, and it's here, and it's everywhere. It's where we live. A third of the people living in the US, just in the US, were impacted by a climate-related disaster this past year. And you may feel motivated to throw into the chat ways that you've been directly impacted by climate change right now to share with your colleagues. But I want to point out that for those of us for whom our Jewish identity includes a connection to the land, to people, and or the culture of Israel, Israel stands to be particularly hit hard by the impacts of climate change, including an imperiling of the region's fresh water and potential increased regional destabilization as a result. And I'll add that the government of Israel is actually one of the founding partners of the Jewish Climate Leadership Coalition. Climate change is what's known as a threat multiplier, and I think for you guys in particular, this is really relevant. For every issue that a Jewish organization might care about, food insecurity, homelessness, racial injustice, climate change exacerbates the issues that puts our families, our elderly, our clientele, our most vulnerable at risk. And lastly, those least responsible and least able to cope with the impact of climate change are the hardest hit and generally speaking did the least to create that situation. And so there's an element of justice here that's really relevant as well. So while reducing the Jewish community's greenhouse gas emissions alone will not save the world, our community's collective action can be extremely significant. We need to mobilize the collective power and resources of our Jewish communities and commit to climate action now. And the good news is that we actually have the knowledge, we have the technology, and we have the tools necessary to take action. I'm really excited to share that there's nothing I'm going to share with you today that really isn't within the capacity of your organization to take action on. And just to give three great examples, the Associated, which is the Baltimore Jewish Federation, is now powering the equivalent of 50% of their entire operations through solar. That's our photo here on the left. In the center, Jewish Family Services in Vancouver, Canada, opened a new food hub, and they're serving 100% vegetarian kosher food. there are interesting and powerful connections between our food choices and climate impacts, and the ways to make climate smart food service choices. Their choice here of being vegetarian was intentional and very much related to climate impact. On the right is a congregation called MF in California, and they recently designed and built a net zero energy and zero waste synagogue facility. So things like this are happening across the Jewish world with more and more common. And taking climate action not only helps to mitigate the global climate crisis, it can also bring our own organizations significant benefits, such as cost savings, meaningful engagement opportunities for community members of all ages. And just a little bit about who we are. For over 20 years, Adama has been a leader in the growing field of Jewish environmental education. Adama is a merger of earlier this spring of an organization named Hazon that you may have heard of. Hazon has been around for over 20 years, and also the Pearlstone Retreat Center. And together we are leading we're actually the largest faith-based nonprofit in North America addressing environmental and climate issues. And we're a leader in the growing field of Jewish environmental education. And we know from experience, and it's been actually confirmed by studies as well, that engaging in food, farming, outdoor, and environmental education from a Jewish perspective is a powerful way of reaching Jews from across the spectrum and building vibrant community. And I don't know how much this is relevant for your organizations, but I'll share that climate change is an important issue to Jews of all ages. But to note that for Gen Z youth, 67% of Gen Z youth and 71% of millennials say that climate is a top priority. Young people today feel more deeply than anyone else that if we fail to take significant action now, the world will be passing forward to our children and grandchildren will be far more unstable for Jewish and human life than the world of today. So committing to climate action is a powerful way to demonstrate to our young people that our organizations acknowledge and are responding to their concerns. So if engaging young people in your organization, in your work, and even if they're among your staff, that's a helpful thing to keep in mind. So in summary, the global climate crisis represents a historic inflection point for our planet, our communities, and our people. And Jewish tradition compels us to respond. What we do today matters. Our actions today will ripple forward in time, and it is our responsibility to face the crisis with the full energy, resiliency, and resources of the Jewish community. And so I will share with you a bit about the Jewish Climate Leadership Coalition and how I think it can be relevant to your organizations. And one thing I want to share is that we understand that for many organizations, the barrier to taking climate action is not understanding why or that it is vitally important, but rather how. Many of us are paralyzed by overwhelm and confusion. And so the coalition was designed to help get past that paralyzation, past that confusion. And I want to be clear that the coalition is open to Jewish communal organizations across the globe. You do not have to be in North America to join. Most of our resources are applicable regardless of what country you're in. But I will say it is true that some of our information and our staff expertise is strongest in North America. For example, we are not familiar with the solar installation norms or rebate opportunities outside of the United States. But the fact that going solar is a priority and overall steps for how to move in that direction are universally applicable. So I'm really happy to address any questions you might have about if it makes sense for your organization to join the coalition based on where you are in the world. And so, so anyways, the Jewish Climate Leadership powered by Adama. Here's what Adama is about. You can go and learn more about that on our website if you want to do that. But to introduce the coalition, to just share, it's a coalition of Jewish community organizations who, as it says here, recognize the existential threat and moral urgency of the crisis and are committed to taking action. It is the largest communal effort the Jewish community has ever seen to mobilize a collective Jewish response to the climate crisis. And this is exciting, and we hope you'll come and be a part of this. But the coalition is bringing together federations, day schools, synagogues of all denominations, camps, Hillels, social service agencies, foundations, rabbinical schools, JCCs, and more. And we support them in reducing their own greenhouse gas emissions and taking climate action at their institutional level. We are working to leverage the collective influence and resources of our organized Jewish community and model scalable climate action that will bring about our shared vision of a healthier, more sustainable, and more equitable world for all. And 20 founding partners came together to form this coalition. And you can see here that they represent a broad swath of mainstream Jewish life. And these organizations came together a little over a year ago to found the coalition. You may say or see organizations here that you're affiliated with, that you're a part of, or that you partner with. And these organizations were the first to release their own climate action plans, which are all on our website now. And they did that in Tu B'Shvat earlier this year. And so then the coalition opened publicly last September. And I'm excited to share that we have over 220 members now, well on our way to our goal of 250 by the end of this year, and ultimately a goal of 1,500. And that collective impact, everybody doing their part and combined together, really makes a huge difference. So what does it mean on a practical level to join the coalition? Members of the coalition designate a staff liaison to lead their climate action work. And the organization commits to developing, implementing, evaluating, and sharing an organizational climate action plan annually. And these climate action plans detail what you've done to date and set goals for reducing an organization's emissions in the coming year. And to be clear, there are no minimum requirements for a climate action plan. And we want to meet you where you are and help you move forward. And I want to highlight there's no cost to join the coalition. The goal of the coalition is to make meaningful climate action accessible to Jewish institutions, and we're seeking to reduce barriers to entry as much as possible. But what you're really here to hear about today is, so what is climate action? What does that look like? And this is stuff that you can do whether you're in the coalition or not. And so let's talk about what climate action means within the coalition. For coalition members, Adama is developing a lot of resources to help you in two primary areas of work. One is to achieve organizational net zero greenhouse gas emissions within your own institutions, and then to engage the broader Jewish community in climate action, what we're calling expanding impact. And what I'm going to share with you now is overall what is in these categories, and then hone in on what this means for your organization's headquarters. So first, getting to net zero emissions. As I go through these, I'll flag that these apply to headquartered-like organizations like you. I'll highlight what you can tackle in-house after we get through these. So I'll note that many of the founding partners in our coalition are organizations like yours. They're indeed like umbrella organizations. They do a huge amount of work, but they actually have remote staff. They might not have offices, or if they have offices, they're renting them. And they, in some ways, may have limited direct emissions themselves from their operations in their headquarters spaces. These organizations were the first to release climate action plans earlier this year. And as I said, they're all published on our website. So if you want to see 20 concrete examples of what Jewish HQ organizations are doing to address climate change, you can go and check those out. They're on our website, which I'll type into our chat when we finish up. And you may find those really instructive. But we've identified 4 solutions through which an organization can ultimately achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. They are to source clean electricity, purchasing clean electricity from the grid, or producing your own with solar. Going electric, making a plan that documents your non-electric appliances like gas furnaces and boilers, and when they will expire, and start planning now for how to replace them with an electric version. And making, then you can further reduce your emissions. You can make energy efficiency retrofits, address your food and travel procurement practices, and manage natural resources to sequester carbon through nature-based solutions. And then lastly, you can offset the emissions that you are unable to reduce otherwise. Some greenhouse gas emissions are unavoidable. And so after taking these above steps to reduce them, for those that cannot be eliminated, you can purchase the vetted greenhouse gas offsets. These are the areas where Adama has the greatest number of internal resources to support your organization's climate action work. Then, expanding impact. Reducing your own greenhouse gas emissions alone aren't going to get you where you need to be, so we've identified a second area of focus for climate action work, namely expanding the impact of your organization's climate action work beyond the walls of your institution and engaging the broader Jewish community in climate action. And it may be here for your organizations that there's a lot you can be doing in these spaces. One is education and nature connection. You're going to engage your communities. That could be your own staff, that could be your donors, that could be the wider community that receives your newsletter, that could be the organizations that you participate with and support. Engage them through programs, celebrations, and learning moments that ground us in our connection with the earth and inspire collective action. You can advocate for climate smart policy, and we have lots of partners who are doing a lot of work in this area, but that could be a particularly potent role as representatives of the communities that you work with. And lastly, finance. Choose your own organizational investments, endowments, and banking relationships based on their climate impacts. So how might this look for organizations like yours? You could be advocating for clean electricity with your landlords. If you don't own your own building space, it doesn't mean that's the end of the conversation. You as tenants may have a lot of influence and power with your landlords. You could also be supporting your remote employees in accessing clean electricity. Whether it's just staff gatherings, staff retreats, huge conferences, or food that you're organizing for externally facing programs, serve climate-friendly food. I'm actually Adama's Director of Food and Climate and do entire hour to 2-hour presentations on the connection between our food choices and climate change. And serving food that is vegetarian or fully plant-based is a significant way to make a difference. Think about how to minimize your air travel and incorporate offsets to offset the air travel that you do. Host climate-friendly conferences and retreats. We have an entire guide on how to do that as for coalition members. As I mentioned before, advocacy, where it's mission aligned with your work, can make a really big difference. Standing up, using your voice in that way. Education, again, where it's mission aligned. It may not make sense to randomly do a session on climate change, but if it's directly related to one of your projects, one of your initiatives, it's going to be really, really powerful. And as I mentioned before about the climate-friendly investments and employee retirement benefits, there's ways to deploy your resources and investments to make a big difference. And we're going to basically kind of get into some Q&A about what this could really look like. But I'll just quickly share that when you join the coalition, we support you in being able to take action on these. I've just given the broadest surface level strokes. If you're in the coalition, and a little bit through our Q&A here, we have resource guides, we have templates for your climate action plans. Every 2 weeks, we have seminars and workshops. We have weekly 2-hour blocks of office hours where you can meet with our staff one-on-one for consultation and support. We network you with other organizations like yours and communities of practice. And we also have a climate action fund where organizations can apply for interest-free loans up to $100,000 and matching grants up to $10,000. Our next deadline for those applications is mid-October. And so with that, I'll just quickly say that before we wrap up, the steps for engaging with the coalition. At any point, you can register by going to adama.org/coalition. Again, I'll put that in the chat, and fill out the registration form at the bottom. Then organizations attend a coalition orientation, which helps you learn how to access all of our various resources. You'll be put in a community of practice, which meet 4 times a year. As I mentioned, we have our online workshops and seminars, our weekly office hours, and other resources are ongoing. And all coalition members work on their climate action plans and submit them on Tu B'Shvat of each year. And I'll just say that this year is the first in a new Shemitah or sabbatical 7-year cycle. And just like the climate scientists, we want to be forward thinking to the next 7 years before 2030. It's very classic for us to overestimate what we can do in a year and underestimate what we can do in 7 or 10 years. And so we want you to get on this journey and start taking steps. And with Adama, we can help you get where you want to go. And hopefully we gave you a sense of what we can do that's relevant for your community. If not, that's what our next few minutes of questions are. But here's the website where you can learn all about what we're up to. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen, open it up here, and I suspect that there will be some conversation about some of the things I briefly mentioned and to dive in deep more into those. So thank you for listening to me jabbering on. Emma, please open us up.
Thank you so much, Becky. That was great. Like you were saying, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to just say it out loud or put it in the chat, and Becky will be able to respond to any questions that you have. Anyone want to get started?
And I will flag if there's anything that was in the chat while I was speaking. I didn't see that, so go ahead and re-chat it or re-ask.
Perhaps people might have questions about how they can implement some of these suggestions that Becky was putting forward, if anyone wants to ask about those kind of things.
Becky, hi, Yael from OLAM. Could you say a few more words about carbon offsetting in terms of how to even kind of start that process and go about it?
Absolutely, sure. Yeah, so one thing that I'll say is that there's a benefit to measuring and knowing things, and there's also, it shouldn't be a barrier. And so, we talked about net zero emissions, but we actually don't get bogged down in what exactly are all your emissions. We know the steps that you need to take to reduce them. And when it's time to get offsets, just a first piece of advice is not to stress out about what is it? Do we need to offset 100 or 200 or 1,000,000? What to really do is to go and research. And we have a resource guide in the coalition that really holds your hand through all these steps of what are the offsets that might make sense. And for organizations like this, you might really be able to find ones that are mission aligned, or there are organizations that are doing offsets in the country where you do work. So carbon offsets are that there are ways that we can take greenhouse gases, carbon out of the atmosphere. And so if we're putting it in, obviously we want to not put it in, right? We just we're not going to get ahead if we just keep putting them in and invest in things to pull it out. We need to put a lot less in. But there are still emissions that are going to happen. So we really want to prioritize, you saw the order we put it in there, do all these things, offset the rest. But that doesn't mean you have to wait. As soon as you can start investing in carbon offsetting, that's wonderful. But you want to still be reduced. You don't want to use offsetting as a kind of a greenwashing way to be like, oh, we offset everything. We don't have to change any of our behavior. We can keep doing whatever we do. So some of it's just framing around that. But in our resource guide, we explain the things when we say vetted carbon offsets. What does it mean to be vetted? How do you know that this isn't just a scam? How do you know that this is genuinely reducing greenhouse gas emissions and that your contribution are creating new reductions that weren't going to happen otherwise? And so we talk through some of those steps. We give a couple of places that we refer you to look at. And a big space the offsets exist around is air travel. We haven't figured out a way to fly you from here to there without emitting emissions. We have figured out a way for you to have your lights on without emissions. We're coming a long way with sustainable energy, but a lot of the offsets is really around travel. And so you're going to have the travel of your own organization's staff, the travel that the work you do is causing. And there are loads of calculators out there where you can put in flights. And I will say that many airlines are building in offset programs so that you could just offset directly with that airline's own program, or your organization could make an estimate at the flight impact of your entire staff over the period of a year and pick one and build it into your budget. Again, this is after deciding if we really need to even be taking those flights. Another angle where this could play out for some of you with offsets is if you are hosting a gathering, whether it's just a board retreat for 10 or 20 people, or a major conference with dozens or hundreds or thousands of people coming together. Those people are likely traveling to you, to your event, and creating a lot of emissions and warming our climate as a result of that. And so there's a couple of ways that you could look at, how do we offset this all ourselves as the host of this event? What would it look like to do that and build that into our budget? You could also build that into the cost of participants' registration, and have there be a cost sharing there. It could be required and built in. It could be optional. It could say, click here to add at registration. You may say, click here to have a kosher meal. Click here to give me the swag bag. Click here to add a carbon offset. And you could match it. You could just have the person registering pay for it all themselves. So there's different ways to think about, like, building that in. And going back to the educational piece, to say it's I think very informative when you model that. Your influencers, the people that you work with, are looking at your organization as a model of how to be in the world, right? This kind of the sector that you guys are in are really leaders. And for them to see, like, oh, this organization is thinking about that kind of thing. Oh, I should be thinking about that kind of thing too. So not only are you having the actual offsets happening, you're also expanding your impact by educating those in your sphere to understand, like, oh yeah, it matters that I'm getting on this airplane. That's impacting something, and I need to take some responsibility for that. And I guess one piece I'll just say, kind of philosophical about this, is a lot of things that we can do to address climate change is going to save us money. It's going to be budget neutral or save us money. And in fact, for overwhelmingly, it's inaction in the face of climate change that's going to be expensive, not taking action. But there are things that we're used to being really cheap, right? We want to get the cheapest airfare possible. We want to have the cheapest disposable dishes and just everything be convenient. And it costs more out of dollars of our pocket. But I think we understand here that we're externalizing those costs. And I think in this particular sector in general, you understand that it's invisible to us. Well, whatever, I do this, I just throw it away, it goes away, and I don't have to think about it again. That's why it's cheap, because someone somewhere else is paying for it with their factory labor, with the polluted air next to where they live in their low-income neighborhood. Someone somewhere else is paying for that. So us stepping up and saying, we need to internalize those costs. This is what this actually really costs. And we actually need to pay that cost, not get it as cheaply as possible and let someone else pay for it. So philosophically, I'm getting a little preachy here, but for organizations like this, and here in a Jewish space, or a Jewishly, grounded space, to think in some of those terms, I think is really helpful as we do our work.
Thank you very much, Becky. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask?
Hi, I'm Avital from JDC Grid. Sorry, I'm without camera. Thank you. I see some comments in the chat regarding smallholder farmers, and we work a lot with smallholder farmers in Africa, mainly in Ethiopia, but also in other countries. In what ways can carbon, can this work for this kind of projects? Because all of these projects obviously are very good for reducing and helping the climate disaster with saving water and clean energy cooking stoves and other things that are extremely good. So I wondered if Adama Coalition helps to do this carbon offset, and perhaps even having a way for funding for these organizations or these projects.
So I think I'm not exactly clear. Are you suggesting that some of the smallholder farms that you work with, is there a way to connect them with these carbon offset programs and for them to receive funding in that way?
That they can do it individually, like most of them do not have access to internet or even telephone or stuff like this, but maybe we as organizations can take those projects and for example, I heard that there are some, I don't know, maybe you don't work on these issues. I heard that there are some clean energy cooking stoves that are cheaper because those companies receive offset and like they kind of get points or money for giving points for this. I don't know the terminology. I'm sorry. I'm very new to this area, but to this carbon offsets. And so, are you dealing with it?
We are not directly dealing with that, but what I would say is that there is so much going on out there. And as I mentioned around offsets, you may find offset programs that are particularly relevant to the type of work or communities that you're working with. And so I would just research that. I myself am not an expert on it, and it may be actually that our next speaker, Laura, can speak more to the international possibilities around that. I won't speak for Laura, but I'm hoping she may be able to provide a more satisfying answer than I can on that. Yeah.
With that, does anyone have any final questions before we pass over to Laura?
I have a small question from India here.
Hi.
My question is, we're a small organization, the Gabriel Project, operating out of India, and we work in a very rural tribal district. And we have taken steps a couple of years ago to take some climate action steps. For example, some of our vehicles that we use in our work are now electric vehicles. All the cleaning equipment and the chemicals that we use have been stopped, and we use only organic cleaning equipment and chemical, organic materials. We also do organic farming. My question is, how do we frame some climate?
Oh no.
Lost you for a second. I kind of
Year on year to see if we are making a difference to the whole. Hello.
Hi. You said my question is, and then you froze, and we didn't hear the question. If you can repeat the question,
Okay.
Please.
I'm so sorry. I'm traveling from a village. So the question is, how do we frame targets for ourselves as an organization working in a project area, and then how do we measure if we are reaching up those targets, and what are the measurable indicators we can use for the little climate action steps that we are taking in our organization, and are there any resources available that we could have to measure ourselves whether we are making any progress in that?
Yeah, well, so I will say, I think that Laura's going to have a different take on this, and I think this is really going to be great for this group. Our strategy in our organization at Adama is that it is important to get working on the areas where you're making your biggest emissions, and the targets are essentially project-based. So the targets are, we want to source all clean electricity. So we need to, what are our options? Is that through our own grid? Is that through putting on our own solar, that sort of thing? And that's the project. And then that project is achieved. The next target, or something you're working on similarly, get all of our appliances that may be running on gas and get them on electric. Okay, so we have project-based targets, and we're getting emissions from here. Let's do vehicles. Phenomenal that you've done vehicles. You're light years ahead of many organizations who have not gotten electric vehicles. And so we have the project-based targets, and it is we have found, and this is a strategic choice that we made as an organization, to say if organizations get bogged down in measuring. And these are organizations that's like yours. This is not our J job. Like our day job is executing on our mission. We're a synagogue, we're a human service agency, we're a JCC. We're not a reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions organization. We're doing bar mitzvahs and summer camps and running food kitchens. So we are giving them projects, and that they are not going to say our electric bill and this is our scope 1 and this is our scope 2 and this is our scope 3. We're getting them down. We know these organizations actually don't have the resources to do that, and it's going to slow or stop or overwhelm them from doing the work. So we are doing project-based targets. I know from seeing Laura's slides that she might have an answer that's more aligned and more satisfying to what you're looking for, but I hope this provides a balance for you that you can actually feel really strong and good about what you're doing, identify where other areas are, and go and do those projects. And as you keep knocking them off, knowing our emissions are falling and falling and falling as you do each of those things. So I hope that that's somewhat helpful.
Thank you, Becky. We're now going to pass over to Laura, who's going to start her presentation. Thank you again, Becky, for everything.
Thank you, everyone.
Excited to hear from Laura.
Cool. Thanks so much, Becky. And thank you for everyone for your questions. Just going to set my screen up. Emma, will you give me a shout when it's all good?
Yeah, you can see the whole, we need to, yeah, that's it. That's perfect.
Perfect. Cool. So thank you everyone for joining and for listening. I'm going to be talking about some quite similar stuff to what Becky has just presented on, but specifically from the position of an international humanitarian charity, of which World Jewish Relief is just one. So firstly, a bit of background as to what's going on across the international humanitarian sector in terms of motivation and accountability on measuring our carbon footprint. So you may already be aware that the IFRC has a climate charter specifically for humanitarian organizations. And under this charter, which many of us have signed up to, I think it came out a couple of years ago, we have signed up to 7 commitments across many different aspects of the environment. One of them is specifically on maximising the environmental sustainability of our work and rapidly reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So anyone who wants to find out more can go onto their website. If you type in IFRC Climate Charter, or if you follow this link here when we distribute the slides afterwards, you can see all of the different 7 commitments. But essentially, the second commitment is really trying to remind humanitarian organizations that this isn't just about the environment, it's about one of our core values, which is doing no harm. So even when we are doing a program activity which is aiming to do good in the world, it's basically useless if we don't try and prevent any of the damage that would also be doing to the climate. But I would encourage you all to go and look on their website, because it has a lot of information about how to meet this commitment. And yeah, it's very useful. So across the different commitments that it has, the 2 that I'm going to talk about today are reducing greenhouse gas emissions and offsetting emissions. So just a few little technical details around greenhouse gas emissions that are worth considering. You might already be aware of scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. You might not be. So basically this just breaks down all of the emissions that an organisation has into, I think I have more detail on the next slide. Sorry. So scope 1 is all of the emissions that are under our direct control. So if our organisation was literally producing energy from fossil fuels, we would have lots of scope 1 emissions. But that obviously isn't something that any of us have to worry about. Scope 2 emissions are all of those caused by the production of the energy that you purchase. So if you have an office space and you're purchasing electricity, gas, if you have refrigerators, air conditioning, all of the energy that's being that you're purchasing to run all of those is your scope 2 emissions. And then scope 3 is basically everything else. So anything that you purchase or any services that you provide for partners, all of those emissions. So anything to do with your travel, for goods that you purchase, logistics, so any transport of goods by plane, boat, car, your use of water. Data storage is another really big one. This scope 3 is where most humanitarian organizations see all of their emissions. And then an extra rung that you might want to think about is emissions from your employees, which relate to them working for you. So if they're commuting to work, if you have a lot of employees that are working from home, and because they're not in an office, they're at home, they're then heating it, powering it with electricity, you need to think about that as well. And then if you have employees coming into the office eating meat and dairy, all of that will have emissions as well that you might want to think about. So other things to try and think about when you are looking at measuring your emissions for the first time would be, if you're working in partnership with other organizations, which emissions on the project are you responsible for, and which emissions are they responsible for? So for example, if World Jewish Relief is doing a food package distribution with one of our partners in Ethiopia, and we are their sole donor on this project, we're their sole donor at the moment, and we might fund £100,000, and then they take care of implementing the procurement of the food packages and then actually distributing them within the program site in Ethiopia. We are technically responsible as the donor, as a sole donor, for 100% of their office emissions. Never mind the purchase of the food, the transport of that food, all of what their employees are doing, because we're the sole donor. It gets slightly more complicated when you have a partner who's receiving funds from multiple different donors, especially if it's one project that has multiple donors, and breaking that responsibility down gets a bit more complicated, but it's something to consider. You might also need to be able to understand the units of measurement. So you might often see something called CO2e, or tons of CO2e. That basically means tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So we sometimes use the terms carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas interchangeably, but obviously carbon dioxide is just one of 7 types of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the most important. It's the one that we're emitting the most of. So we calculate all of the greenhouse gases in terms of their equivalents to carbon dioxide. So if you see that your emissions are 100 tons of CO2 equivalent, that might actually break down into 90 tons of CO2 and then 20 tons of methane, if methane was half as if it had half the impact that CO2 did per ton when it was in the atmosphere. So yeah, you'll basically always see it in CO2 equivalent, but that is incorporating all of the other greenhouse gases. So I won't dwell too long on this because I think Becky's covered this topic really nicely, but just to show you what World Jewish Relief did when we first tried to measure our emissions. We went with an organisation called Greener, who helped us understand the process, collect the data, and then they told us what our emissions were. So you can see here on the screen, they broke it down for us into our scope 1, our scope 2 and our scope 3 emissions, and then our emissions that we might be responsible for from employees. And then they showed us how that broke down. So this pie chart on the screen just shows scope 1, 2 and 3. So you can see that the majority of our emissions came from purchase of goods and services. And a big part came from commuting, from office electricity and gas, and then from plane travel as well. So interestingly, this was from a year when we still had reduced travel compared to normal because of COVID and a slow return to visiting our partners. So we're doing it again now for 2022 to 2023 financial year, and we're expecting this to look very different just because our behaviour has changed quite a lot. But this is what we did for our headquarters, and it was really helpful because then now we can see, okay, if we want to reduce our emissions, we really need to take a look at our goods and services first, and that would be the best entry point for us to make a difference quickly. The other part of our carbon work is looking at our international emissions. So like many organisations in the humanitarian sector, we work through local partners. Some also have offices across lots of different countries and partners, so it does get very complicated. Then you have to think about, there are different standards and regulations around carbon calculation, different average emission or emission factors per type of car, per type of energy in every country. So when you're trying to calculate this internationally, it does become more complicated. So to try and help organisations out with that, IFRC has put together this Humanitarian Carbon Calculator. It's very new. I think it's only been running for about a year, and they made it in collaboration with lots of different humanitarian organisations to try and make it really practically useful. And Angela's going to talk in a little bit about how they actually have already used this within HIAS. But first, I'm just going to give a quick example to show what it's like to use that calculator. So I'm going to switch over. So basically, the calculator is an Excel document that you can download from their website, and we will share the links for all of you to find this. And it has several different tabs along the bottom. So you start off with general information about your organisation, and then you can go through and you input data points to help you work out your emissions under each of these different categories. So I'll do a worked example. Imagining we have, go back. So I've made up an NGO called End Hunger. It has a headquarters in London with 30 full-time staff and 10 part-time staff. Its main activities are that it funds cash transfers, food packages, medicines, NFIs, or like non-food items, so blankets, clothes, tents, in 4 Southeast Asian countries, so Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. The way they work is all through local partners, so they have one partner in each country. They procure all of the goods locally, and then they drive them by car by distances up to 200 kilometers. This NGO also has quite a lot of travel to think about. So they make sure that one staff member goes to each of the 4 countries twice a year for a monitoring visit. And I've done a quick bit of research to see how far those flights would be to get to the capital city in each of those countries. So based on that, we should be able to have a go at using the carbon calculator. So the first tab on the sheet doesn't require much from us. It's very basic information. So I've put in our entity, which is our UK headquarters in London. And then it asks for FTE, which is full-time equivalent. So how many full-time staff?
Laura, we're still seeing your slideshow. I don't know if you mean to be showing us something different.
Thank you. No, it should be on
you might need
now. I'll change it. Thank you. I'll just share my screen. So can you see a spreadsheet?
Yes. Oh,
Okay,
yes.
hopefully that will make more sense. Yeah. So this is the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator. Sorry, I didn't show that before. So it's just a spreadsheet you can download off their website, and it's set up so that as you put data in, it updates automatically, and then it gives you your carbon footprint from your international work. So this first sheet just wants some general information. So you pop in, if you had a really big international organization with multiple country offices and country teams, you could put them all in here. But we're just doing for quite a small INGO with a London office and then some international partners. So we just have our first entity here. It asks you for some basic information like the surface area of your office, your global budget, and then the internal FTE, which is the full-time equivalent. So how many full-time staff you have. So I said at the beginning, this made up NGO has 30 full-time, and I think I said 10 part-time. So that would be about 35 full-time equivalent staff. So then we go on to energy. So you can see here we've got, if you were actually combusting energy and creating energy, you would be filling out these, but obviously we're a humanitarian charity, not an evil fossil fuel company, so we can ignore that. And then we scroll down and you can look at electricity and find which country it's being purchased in. They've then done a massive load of research into the emissions factors in each country. So they've worked out on average per kilowatt hour of energy, how much carbon dioxide equivalent you would be emitting in kilograms. And they have a number for, I think, almost every country in the world. So you can scroll down, find the country that you have the office in, and then you go across, you put in how much energy you have, how certain you are about the data, and then you scroll across all the way, and the calculations start to emerge here. So if we have a go for our made up NGO, let's find it. So I've gone through and highlighted where we need to look because it's quite a big spreadsheet. So I said one of the countries we're in is Indonesia, and you can see they've got here the emissions factor. So they've calculated on average that per kilowatt hour of energy that you purchase in Indonesia, you're emitting 0.94 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So if we had around 3,000 kilowatt hours, here, you put it in. The certainty, there are strict rules on how you work out the certainty. So I'll just go back and show you those. So if your certainty is 25%, if the data has just been estimated from public figures or national studies. So if I didn't know what my Indonesian partner's office energy use was, but I just Googled average Indonesian office energy use per year, and I took that figure, the certainty would only be 25%. And it goes all the way up to 100%. So the more extreme version would be if I literally had on the bill for the office what the purchase of electricity was and how much electricity that provided, and I used that exact figure, then the certainty would be 100%. So we're going to say, for example, our partner NGO just showed us how much energy they purchased, so the certainty would be 100%. And then you would scroll across and you can see it started to fill it out now. So the emissions are 2,817 kilograms of CO2. We can then go through and fill that out for the other countries. So for Myanmar, let's say it was around 2,000 kilowatt hours, but our certainty was only 25%. In the Philippines,
Laura, we're running a little bit behind, so maybe we can do this in a more vague sense.
Sure. Okay, I'll really quickly run through it. But basically, that's all you do. So you do it for the electricity, you put in the energy use, the certainty, and you scroll across and it starts to put itself out. And then for goods and services, you would look, okay, let's say we purchased cash assistance. You would look in Indonesia, okay, they've got the emissions factors, you go along and then you put in what did you spend on that cash distribution in US dollars, how certain are you, and then you scroll across and you get the answers start to populate themselves. You do it for all of these different categories, and then you eventually get your results. So they'll show you what your emissions are under scope 1, 2, and 3. And they'll even start to put it in nice graphs for you. So it breaks down where your emissions are, and it's really easy to then guide your organization and work out how you can start reducing your emissions. But I'm gonna hand over now to Angela to tell us what HIAS has done, because they've actually used this tool already, I think, for their organization.
All right, thank you so much, Laura. A little bit background about HIAS is that HIAS is a non-government organization that assists refugees and asylum seekers globally. HIAS operates in 22 countries, and definitely the commitment to reducing the environmental impact and carbon footprint is core business. So as you've said, HIAS is registered in the Interaction NGO Climate Compact and the Climate and Environmental Charter for organizations here. So with this, we are committing to address climate changes and maximize our sustainability for the environment. So the We have come a long way in terms of even developing the report that advises our humanitarian carbon calculator. And before I go into details of that, I'd just like to say that the way we have structured ourselves is that we have a green team. It's like an advisory body within the organization, which is very responsible for designing sustainability policies, for reporting of emissions and making recommendations for environmental sustainability. We work through a consultant who is an expert in the climate change. So especially this report that we are talking about, we did it with the support of the consultant, the green team members, our country directors, and various departments of the organization. So in developing the report, we took into consideration the importance of measuring the environmental impact and a baseline to assess our progress in the efforts to reduce carbon emission. So definitely the report aligns to our practices and with the, of course, in line with the initiatives of the charters that I've just mentioned. So the emission sources that we used to create or identify in the report and also evaluate is exactly what Laura was talking about: the upstream emission, the direct emission, and the indirect emissions. And in it came out recommendations on how best we can work, or it's guiding how we work. So the steps, or exactly the way Laura was saying, we took through going through like a research of purchase goods and services, waste generated in the country offices, business travel, all the kind of assets that we have in generating the report to identify the various scopes of emission that we have in the various countries in general. So with this, we are advised, the report for it advises us on how we can reduce the various scopes, like for example, the upstream emission. So we put that in line with our work, and we ensure that we can reduce this by practices such as increasing working from home, the telework kind of arrangement. We also plan or align our businesses' travel in such a way that only travel when there's necessity. We also do promote the use of recycling and recycling. So the green team oversees that countries are in line with some of the recommendations from the report. Of course, definitely looking at now at the direct emissions, that is from controlled operations or owned operations. So the gradually replacing vehicles to, like someone said, the electrical way of cars. It's not immediate, but it's gradually in progress. The other bit I'll talk about is our efforts to reduce indirect emissions. That is reducing the use of electricity, maybe heating or cooling appliances. So I'm not saying all these things we are doing them immediately because they involve definitely a kind of budget at etc. So we are also focusing, or our efforts are focusing on ensuring that our purchases are more equipments which are efficient in terms of energy. In responding, or even in line with the humanitarian carbon calculator, and as most humanitarian organizations do, our contribution to climate change, we have some few steps that we want to integrate in order to honor the solution that we have from or the findings that we have from the humanitarian carbon calculator. That is, we are doing so by, we want to raise awareness, even internally with our own staff, on the importance of measuring and reducing carbon emissions, especially in the support of refugee activities. We are ensuring that we're training, and we usually have some sessions internally to train and capacity build the staff, especially those who are working in the field, to ensure that everyone has the necessary skills to integrate the calculator into their work. Of course, we talk about more of how people can ensure they track their energy consumption, transportation, waste management, so that when you're coming with the next survey that will be done, all this information is well taken care of, data is collected for easy analysis. We are encouraging also, when we are setting targets internally as an organization, we must take into account the carbon calculator in areas, especially where emissions can be reduced, which can be in such as sources like the way I was talking about the transportation, or implementing energy efficient appliances or practices. I think that is all. I have tried to squeeze myself in the 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, Angela. That's great. If people have questions for Angela, we'll have a bit of time to ask both Laura and Angela questions a little bit later on. Thank you so much. And I'll pass back to Laura.
Cool, thanks. Emma, just tell me, how long do I have for the activities?
So we've got just under 25 minutes left. So if we want to leave ourselves about 10 minutes for questions, I think we can spend just under 15 minutes for the activity.
Fab, okay. So the only other thing I wanted to really quickly say was around target setting, because I know there was a question on that. So just as a few examples on the screen, I think with target setting, you can kind of align yourself with whatever you want to. You could align yourself with like a national law, some of the international targets, or you could try and say we want to be ahead of what our government targets are, for example. So you might have something simple like you want to have an environmental policy or an environmental task force in your organization by a certain year. You might want to say that you'll be climate neutral or net zero by a certain year. You might have more specific targets, like we want to get rid of single-use plastics by a certain year, or recycle all of your waste by a certain year. Or you can try and be a bit more measured and have a specific target, like we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by X% below a certain year by a specific year. So it's really up to you, and there are lots of ways that you can go about it. And then just on to an activity. So I think given the time that we have, it might be better to stick with the second one of the two on the screen. So we're going to break out into groups of around 4 people, I think, and consider within your own organization, how would you implement the following activities? So if you wanted to limit your flights, reduce your use of plastic, reduce consumption of meat and dairy, reduce employees' use of private vehicles for their office commutes, procure all of goods and services for any humanitarian work within the country that the programme is taking place in, switching to only renewable energy suppliers, and ending all of the pension fund investments in like fossil fuel companies. If you wanted to implement all of those in your own organisation, what trade-offs would this cause for your different departments? So for specific programs teams, fundraising, comms, IT, HR or finance, what outputs of theirs might suffer if you did any of those measures? And then secondly, who has the decision-making power over each one? And how difficult would it be to get them on side?
All right, I'm going to open up the breakout rooms now. So as people start rejoining, we're just going to have a few minutes before we close to ask Laura and Angela any questions that we might have. I know there's quite a few people who are still waiting to join. So if you have questions, now is a good time to ask them to Laura or Angela. Anyone want to get us started? I saw a few questions in the chat earlier, but if anyone would like to resend them or to say them out loud, all welcome.
Emma, if I may, just one quick thing, just kind of promoting Aspire, OLAM's Aspire program. If you're looking in your organization for a starting point and you really want to have conversations about this, and it's very overwhelming, there's just so much out there, I do recommend that one option is to look at our Aspire ethical climate practices, basically 10 commandments. Like these are the 10 key things that you should be thinking about as an organization. And just kind of have a team meeting, look through it and see like where you really want to start your work and delve deeper in terms of these kind of key findings. So hopefully OLAM can be there for your starting point or as you continue this process.
Thanks, Yael. Anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
I don't have a question, but I'll just a comment to note that I think this is something we already know, but it just, during our conversation, it just came up like how difficult it all is. So one, I just want to appreciate, I really want to thank Laura and Angela and Becky for just raising awareness about this and sharing with us, and just to know about Laura Gold from Giants, as we were leaving, she said, well, it's the small things sometimes, and it's, they do add up. And I just, it just struck me as during our conversation how absolutely difficult it all is to make these decisions that will really make a difference.
Thanks, Naomi.
I'd like to add something. I think the part of the problem with all these it's great what I'm seeing here today. First of all, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, a few years ago, I started looking at carbon offsets and a startup in that, and just to see the energy here. But the problem is how do we really get this message out to the masses of the Jewish people, the Jewish youth today? And that is, and that's why we're having these NGOs, but we need to get grassroots, people involved. How are you addressing that in terms of the organizations?
Well, I can tell you, like, one of the main things that we really saw, and that you saw in those like 2 yellow circles in my presentation, was get to net zero emissions and expand your impact. And there's a sense of we need to be doing both of those things. And so internally, you need to be walking your own talk, working to reduce your own emissions. But if we only stay within our own institutions, we're not punching at our weight. And so it's through that education, advocacy, and finance avenues where we can be getting others out. I can tell you in particular, you might be interested in the Jewish youth climate movement. This has been an organically exploding in a positive way movement of Jewish youth that are self-organizing from basically middle through high school. And now we're finding as the older ones are aging out, they're not done. They want to keep doing this work, and now it's expanding to being on college campuses. And so we are supporting them, and they launched their own kibbutzah, which are chapters of their movement, and getting youth from all over involved. And so if organizations join the coalition, we encourage them to get their youth involved with the Jewish youth climate movement. Conversely, it's sometimes the youth who are motivated. They're already involved as the Jewish youth climate movement, and they're getting their synagogue or their Hillel or their JCC to join the Jewish Climate Leadership Coalition. And so it does work both ways, actually. And so it is through supporting organizations like that. So Jewish Youth Climate Movement is quite exciting. It is happening. I mean, that's the thing. It is happening. So nothing new needs to be done. We need to grow and support the existing amazing activities that are happening out there. So that's one thing I would point you to.
Yeah, my feeling is that we need to make impact, and I'm very much, looking at developing countries, and and the relation that Israel has with these developing countries. And today we have the president of Zambia, and there's a whole presentation of companies to him today. And I think especially in agriculture and food, even the first, even in our first world problem where we have food security and food prices, it's like article this week, they're saying that the prices of food are going up because of global warming, whatever you call it, And one of my feelings is that we need to be sourcing food from the global south, and in areas where it's less impacted by drought or heat or whatever you call it. So I think there has to be this whole mindset change in where our food comes from. And that also has climate. The climate change impact is thing. I don't know if you know. I'll give you a stat. About 40%, 50% of all fruits are lost because of pests and fruit flies, whatever you call it. And that's about a $500 billion loss a year. Okay, and that if you could solve that, you've solved a major the climate change problem. So these are kind of things that a lot of these Israeli companies are working on, and we're trying to take these solutions to Africa and Asia, because this is where the problems are most felt.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks for sharing. We're very close to the end of our time. Does anyone have a final question they'd like to ask before we close? All right, I'll take that as a no. I hope that you had some really good conversations in your breakout rooms and got to kind of talk about some of these issues in more detail. And we will be sending through a recording and some of the resources that were shared today, so that you can follow up on all of this. I just want to close by really extending my gratitude again to Becky, to Laura, and to Angela for everything that they shared today. It was really great to hear your perspectives, like very diverse, but also, you know, shared in your commitment to this work. Thank you also everyone who joined and got actively involved in the breakout rooms. It's really great to see lots of organizations in our network and individual members in our network really showing a commitment to this topic. So thank you so much, and I think this is where we'll bring it to a close.